Learn Japanese history.
We are your navigators, Taro and Hanako.
Okay, today we're jumping into a really pivotal moment, the early 20th century. Massive global changes. And we're looking at how Japan navigated all of this.
Specifically, the lead up to World War I and Japan's decision to get involved. It's a crucial time for understanding Japan's position on the world stage.
Definitely. So, let's set the scene. Europe, early 1900s, things are tense.
Very tense. You've got Germany really pushing its weight around, wanting a bigger global role.
Which naturally bumps up against the established powers. We're talking about the Triple Entente. That's Russia, France, Britain.
Right. And on the other side, the Triple Alliance, Germany, Austria, Hungary, Italy, these big blocks forming.
And underneath all that grand strategy, you have regions just simmering with conflict.
Absolutely. The Balkans, especially. People called it the powder keg of Europe.
Why was it so volatile?
Well, it was a real mix of different ethnic groups, lots of nationalism, and the big European powers were all meddling, trying to increase their own influence there. A recipe for trouble.
And trouble arrived. June 1914, Sarajevo.
The assassination of Archduke Franz Ferdinand of Austria-Hungary and his wife. The trigger.
By a Serbian nationalist. And it's fascinating, isn't it, how quickly that one event just spirals.
It really shows how interconnected everything was, how these alliances locked everyone in. Austria-Hungary declares war on Serbia in July.
Then the dominoes fall. Russia backs Serbia.
Germany backs Austria-Hungary. France is allied with Russia, so they're in. Britain joins France and Russia.
And suddenly, boom, a European war.
A world war, really, given the empires involved.
So Europe's engulfed in flames. Where does Japan fit into this picture? They declare war in August 1914.
Right. They joined the Allied side against Germany. Officially, the goal was framed as expanding and stabilizing Japan's influence in East Asia.
Was there a specific justification they used?
Yes, Anglo-Japanese alliance. It provided the formal pretext. Japan was allied with Britain. Britain was at war with Germany, so Japan could step in. Very. But you have to remember, Japan had its own strategic ambitions in the region. This war in Europe was, well, an opportunity.
And they acted quickly.
They did. They moved to seize Germany's main military base in China, which was in Qingdao on the Shandong Peninsula.
And they didn't stop there.
No, they also took control of some of Germany's island colonies in the South Pacific. While Europe was distracted, Japan was making strategic gains in Asia.
Okay, so Japan's making moves. But what about China itself? It was also going through massive changes, right?
Huge changes. Just a few years earlier, in 1911, you had the Xinhai Revolution.
That was the end of the Qing dynasty.
Exactly. End of centuries of imperial rule. The Republic of China was established in 1912, initially with Sun Yat-sen as provisional president down in Nanjing. Seemed like a fresh start.
But it wasn't that simple.
Far from it. China was deeply divided. Real power often lay with military figures, warlords, and one very powerful figure, Yuan Shikai.
Ah, yes, Yuan Shikai.
He basically pushed Sun Yat-sen aside and set up his own government in Beijing. So the new republic was actually very fragmented and unstable.
And Japan saw this instability.
As another opening. This leads us to 1915 and something called the 21 Demands.
Right, presented by the Suma government in Japan to Yuan Shikai. What were these demands about?
They were sweeping.
Yeah.
I mean, really far-reaching. They aimed to dramatically increase Japan's political and economic control over China, everything from railways and mines in Manchuria and Shandong to even influencing Chinese government appointments.
That sounds incredibly aggressive.
It was. And Japan backed them up with an ultimatum. Basically, accept most of these, or else.
How did China react?
Yuan Shikai's government, being weak and fragmented, felt compelled to accept most of the demands, though not all. But across China, massive outrage, huge surge in anti-Japanese feeling.
You can imagine. That must have really poisoned relations long term.
Absolutely. It created deep resentment that would simmer and boil over later. Japan got some short-term gains, but at a significant diplomatic cost.
Did Japan's push for influence in China stop there?
No, it continued. Under a later cabinet led by Toroshi Masatake, Japan extended very large loans to the Chinese government.
These were the Nishihara loans.
That's right. They were given to the government of Duan Qiri, who was a powerful northern warlord basically running the Beijing government after Yuan Shikai died.
And the goal of these loans? More leverage.
Pretty much. To strengthen Japan's political, military, and economic influence through financial ties. Keep China dependent, in a way.
How did other powers, like the U.S., view all this increasing Japanese influence?
That's a great question. It leads us to the Ishi-Lansing Agreement in 1917 between Japan and the United States.
What did that agreement say?
On the surface, it seems standard. Both sides agreed to respect China's territorial integrity and the open door policy, the idea that all nations should have equal trading rights in China.
Sounds fine, but was there a catch?
There was. The agreement also included language where the U.S. acknowledged that Japan had special interests in China, particularly in areas geographically close to Japan.
Ah, so a bit of having it both ways. Acknowledging the open door, but also Japan's growing sphere of influence.
Exactly. It was complex diplomatic language trying to balance competing interests. It showed the reality of Japan's increasing power in the region.
Okay, so Japan's deeply involved in China. Let's shift gears now to another major event, Russia.
Yes, the Russian Revolution, monumental. March 1917, the Tsar is overthrown.
And then later that year.
November 1917, Lenin and the Bolsheviks seize power. They established the world's first socialist state, the Soviet government.
And one of their first big moves internationally.
Pulling Russia out of World War I, they signed a separate peace treaty with Germany and Austria-Hungary in early 1918.
Which must have worried the other Allied powers. Britain, France, the U.S.
Absolutely. Suddenly, the Eastern Front collapses. Plus, there was ideological fear of this new communist government.
And there was also a specific group stranded in Russia.
Right, the Czechoslovak legions. Tens of thousands of Czech and Slovak soldiers who had been fighting with the Russians against the Central Powers. After Russia left the war, they were stuck deep inside Russia, trying to get out via Siberia.
So the Allies decided to intervene.
Yes, in 1918, the stated reason, the public justification, was to help rescue the Czechoslovak legions. The U.S. actually asked Japan to join in sending troops to Siberia.
And Japan agreed.
They agreed. But they sent a much larger force than the U.S. probably envisioned. Not just a few thousand, but eventually over 70,000 troops.
70,000. That's way more than needed just to help the Czechs.
Exactly. Japan sent troops deep into Siberia, into the Russian coastal provinces, northern Manchuria too. Their aims clearly went beyond just rescuing the Czechs.
What were their real aims then?
It seems they wanted to contain the Bolshevik Revolution, maybe prop up anti-communist forces, and potentially expand Japanese influence in the Russian Far East and Manchuria while Russia was weak.
How did the intervention go?
It dragged on. The other Allied powers, like the U.S. and Britain, pulled their troops out relatively quickly once the Czechs were evacuated and WWI ended.
But Japan stayed.
Japan stayed. For years, they kept a large military presence there until 1922.
That must have drawn criticism.
Huge criticism. Both internationally, other powers wondered what Japan was really up to, and domestically within Japan itself.
Why domestically?
Because it was incredibly expensive, pouring money and resources into Siberia. Soldiers were dying from fighting and the harsh conditions, and for what?
Were there any clear benefits for Japan in the end?
Very few, if any, tangible gains. They didn't stop the Bolsheviks. They didn't carve out a permanent sphere of influence. When they finally withdrew in 1922, it was seen by many in Japan as a costly failure.
Like pouring money into a bottomless well.
That's exactly the kind of language some critics used back then. 4 years, lots of money, lots of lives lost for basically nothing.
So looking back at this whole period, WWI, the moves in China, Siberia, it's a complex picture.
Definitely. We've covered a lot the global context of WWI, Japan seizing German holdings, the aggressive 21 demands on a vulnerable China, the Nishihara loans, the complicated Ishi-Lansing agreement.
And finally, the long, costly, and ultimately fruitless Siberian intervention. It really was a defining period for Japan stepping onto the world stage, wasn't it?
Absolutely pivotal. It set the stage for so much that came later in the 20th century.
Which brings us to a final thought for you, our listeners. Thinking about Japan's goals during this time, expanding influence, securing resources, regional stability on its own terms.
And considering the outcomes, the gains in China, but also the deep resentment caused, the failure in Siberia, how do you think these experiences shaped Japan's thinking? What lessons, right or wrong, might Japanese leaders have taken away from WWI and its aftermath that influenced their path in the 1920s and 30s?
Something definitely worth pondering as you continue exploring Japanese history.